Let's talk tonight about something that authoritarian systems fear more than any foreign enemy, and that is the truth emerging from inside their own ranks. Because this story is not coming from NATO briefings or Western intelligence leaks. It's coming from Russian soldiers themselves. The very troops sent to fight and die in Ukraine are now revealing in plain sight that Vladimir Putin's prized main battle tanks, the symbols of Russian military power, are failing spectacularly on the battlefield. And once that reality becomes undeniable, the entire mythology of strength that props up Putin's rule begins to crack. What makes this moment so striking and so politically dangerous for the Kremlin is not that Western analysts are criticizing Russian tanks. It's that Russian soldiers are doing it themselves in real time from the battlefield. These are not think tank experts or opposition figures speaking from exile. These are men in uniform trained by the Russian state, deployed under Putin's orders, now using their own voices, videos, and leaked messages to expose equipment failures that are impossible to explain away. When soldiers begin documenting tanks that stall before combat, turrets that malfunction, armor that fails catastrophically after a single strike, it punctures the very foundation of state-controlled military mythology. And once that footage escapes into the open, once it's shared on Telegram channels, intercepted by journalists, or picked up by international media, the Kremlin loses its most valuable asset, narrative control. The hook here is that this exposure is coming from the inside, where authoritarian systems are most vulnerable. Russian troops were told they were entering Ukraine with superior firepower, modernized armor, and battlefield dominance. What many encountered instead were outdated systems dressed up as next-generation weapons, plagued by maintenance issues and fatal design flaws. Soldiers have been filmed standing beside burned-out tanks, openly questioning why the vehicles failed so quickly. Others have recorded abandoned armor left behind not because of enemy fire, but because it simply could not move. These are not isolated incidents. They form a pattern, and patterns are dangerous because they are hard to dismiss as accidents. What elevates this beyond a military issue is the credibility of the messengers. In tightly controlled states, soldiers are expected to reinforce propaganda, not contradict it. Yet frustration, fear, and survival instincts are breaking through censorship. When a tank crew watches a supposedly elite vehicle explode after a drone strike, that reality overrides ideology. When they see fellow soldiers killed by equipment that failed to protect them, loyalty to the narrative erodes. The battlefield becomes a place where propaganda collides with physics, and physics always wins. That collision is now being documented by the very people Putin relies on to fight his war. There's also a deeper political tension at play. Russian military pride has long been built around armored warfare. Tanks are not just weapons, they are symbols of national strength, paraded through Red Square, exported abroad, and showcased as proof that Russia remains a global military power. When soldiers themselves reveal that these machines are ineffective, it's not just an admission of technical failure, it's an indictment of the system that produced them. Corruption, rushed production, falsified readiness reports, and embezzled defense funds suddenly become visible in the form of twisted metal on Ukrainian roads. And soldiers know this. They know that the failures they are experiencing are not bad luck, but the result of decisions made far above their heads. This is where the story becomes politically combustible. A regime can survive criticism from outsiders, but it struggles when its own forces begin to lose faith. Soldiers questioning their equipment are also questioning their leadership. Every leaked video, every intercepted complaint, every battlefield image of destroyed armor chips away at the trust that holds an army together. The question quietly spreading among the ranks is a dangerous one. If the tanks don't work, what else have we been lied about? And once that question takes root, it doesn't stay confined to the battlefield. The exposure also changes how the war is perceived globally. When Russian troops themselves confirm what Ukrainian forces and Western analysts have been saying all along, it validates those claims in a way no press conference ever could. It reframes the conflict not as a clash between equal military powers, but as a war revealing the hollow core of a system built on spectacle rather than substance. That matters because perception influences diplomacy, alliances, and long term strategic calculations. A military that cannot trust its own equipment is a military in crisis. And perhaps the most compelling hook of all is this soldiers speaking out are not trying to make a political statement, they are trying to survive. That's what gives their account such power. These are not ideological critiques, they are practical ones, written in the language of fear and experience. A tank that fails is not an abstract problem, it's a coffin. When Russian troops expose that reality, they are unintentionally delivering one of the most damaging political blows to Putin's image of strength, because no amount of state media messaging can fully silence the truth when it's coming from the front lines, spoken by the people who were supposed to embody the myth. What is unraveling right now is not just a weapon system, but a carefully constructed image that Vladimir Putin has spent decades building and defending. The Russian military's reputation, projected as modern, feared, and technologically formidable, has always been central to Putin's political authority. Tanks, in particular, sit at the heart of that image. They roll through Red Square during Victory Day parades, they appear in recruitment ads, and they are exported abroad as proof that Russia remains a great power. But on the battlefields of Ukraine, that image is colliding with reality, and reality is winning. The collapse is not dramatic in a single moment. It is incremental, visible in scorched hulls, stalled convoys, and repeated battlefield failures that are now impossible to spin. Here's the hook that makes this so consequential. Authoritarian power depends on the perception of strength far more than democratic power does. Putin does not rule by persuasion or transparency. He rules by control, intimidation, and the promise that resistance is futile. The Russian military is supposed to embody that promise. When its most iconic machines fail, the illusion of inevitability begins to fade. A tank destroyed by a relatively inexpensive drone or missile is not just a tactical loss, it's a symbolic one. It tells soldiers, civilians, and the world that Russia's power is neither absolute nor untouchable. The Kremlin has long relied on spectacle to reinforce authority. Military hardware has been staged as theater designed to impress audiences at home and abroad. But combat has a way of stripping away stagecraft. In Ukraine, Russian tanks have been exposed operating without adequate infantry support, suffering from poor situational awareness, and falling victim to precision strikes they were never properly designed to withstand. Each failure erodes confidence not only in the machine, but in the leadership that declared it battle ready. When the reality on the ground contradicts the image sold from Moscow, the credibility gap widens, and credibility is everything in a system built on command and obedience. What makes this particularly damaging is that the collapse of image is being documented relentlessly. In previous eras, military failure could be obscured, delayed, or denied. Today, wrecked armor is filmed from multiple angles, geolocated, cataloged, and shared within hours. Russian state media can try to reframe losses, but it cannot erase visual evidence. The burned out tanks scattered across Ukrainian terrain become a counter narrative stronger than any official statement. And that counter narrative keeps repeating itself day after day until denial becomes implausible even for loyal audiences. There is also an internal dimension that the Kremlin cannot fully control. Soldiers who see elite units lose equipment with alarming speed begin to question the competence of those issuing orders. Officers forced to explain repeated losses without clear answers lose authority. The chain of command weakens not because of rebellion, but because belief erodes. A military functions on trust, trust in leadership, trust in strategy, trust in equipment. When the image of invincibility collapses, that trust fractures, and fractured trust is contagious. Politically, this exposure strikes at the core of Putin's legitimacy. He has positioned himself as the man who restored Russian pride after the chaos of the 1990s. Military strength is central to that story. When tanks fail publicly and repeatedly, it challenges the very narrative that justifies his long rule. The message implicit in these failures is uncomfortable and dangerous. If the military is not as strong as promised, then perhaps the leadership is not as competent as claimed. That question doesn't need to be asked aloud to be destabilizing. Its power lies in its quiet spread. Internationally, the image collapse carries consequences that extend far beyond Ukraine. Allies reassess, adversaries recalibrate, and neutral states take note. A military once assumed to be a peer competitor begins to look brittle, constrained, and overstated. That shift influences diplomatic leverage, arms sales, and strategic deterrence. Power is not just about what you have, it's about what others believe you can do. As Russian tanks fail in plain view, belief drains away. The most compelling hook in this story is that the collapse is self-inflicted. Putin did not lose control of the narrative because of a single catastrophic defeat, but because reality kept intruding. Every destroyed tank becomes a reminder that image cannot substitute for performance. Every failure reinforces the same message: projection is not power. And once that lesson is learned, by soldiers, by citizens, by the world, it cannot be unlearned. The defining reality of this war is that it is not being fought with the assumptions of the past, and Russian armor is paying the price for that miscalculation. For decades, main battle tanks were designed around a Cold War logic: thick frontal armor, powerful guns, and massed formations pushing through enemy lines. That model assumed visibility, distance, and predictable threats. Ukraine has shattered those assumptions. The battlefield is now saturated with cheap drones, real-time surveillance, precision-guided missiles, and network targeting that turns heavy armor into something dangerously exposed. Russian tanks are not failing because they are poorly built alone. They are failing because the environment they were designed for no longer exists. The hook here is simple but devastating. A weapon that dominates parades can be obsolete in combat. Modern Ukrainian forces are using drones that cost a fraction of a tank's price to spot, track, and destroy vehicles worth millions of dollars. These drones don't just attack, they observe. They hover above the battlefield, feeding coordinates to artillery units and loitering munitions and anti-tank teams. A Russian tank that fires once can be located within seconds. Once identified, it becomes a stationary target in a battle space where concealment is nearly impossible. The tank's greatest strength, its size and firepower, has become its greatest weakness. Russian tank doctrine has struggled to adapt to this reality. Many vehicles operate without adequate electronic warfare protection, without effective drone countermeasures, and without integrated air defense. Ukrainian forces exploit this gap relentlessly. A tank does not need to be destroyed outright to be neutralized, damaging optics, mobility systems, or communications can render it useless. Videos from the battlefield show tanks immobilized by drone, dropped explosives, abandoned by crews who know that staying inside turns the vehicle into a death trap. This is not traditional tank warfare. It is attritional, asymmetric, and unforgiving. Another critical factor is the proliferation of modern anti tank weapons that are designed specifically to defeat heavy armor. Top attack missiles strike where tank armor is thinnest. Loitering munitions circle patiently, waiting for the right moment. These systems remove the advantage of mass and force Russian crews into constant vulnerability. Even advanced armor packages struggle against weapons that attack from above or behind. Angles once considered secondary, the battlefield has become three-dimensional, and tanks were never fully redesigned for that reality. What makes this especially damaging is how quickly adaptation is required and how slowly it has come. Modern warfare rewards flexibility, rapid learning, and decentralized decision making. Russian military structure, by contrast, remains rigid and hierarchical. Adjusting tactics, integrating new countermeasures, or rethinking armored formations requires approvals that move slower than the pace of combat. Ukraine, fighting a defensive and adaptive war, has shown far greater agility. When one tactic stops working, another appears. Russian armor, locked into outdated operational thinking, keeps encountering the same lethal outcomes. There is also a psychological dimension that amplifies the technical one. Tank crews now operate knowing they are being watched at all times. The constant presence of drones creates stress, hesitation, and fatigue. Movement becomes dangerous. Halting becomes dangerous. Even concealment offers no guarantee of safety. This persistent surveillance erodes effectiveness long before a shot is fired. A weapon system that depends on confidence and coordination cannot perform optimally when crews expect to be targeted the moment they reveal themselves. The broader implication is that modern warfare has shifted the balance away from expensive, centralized platforms toward distributed, networked systems. Ukraine's success demonstrates that intelligence, adaptability, and precision can outperform sheer mass. Russian tanks, designed to project dominance through force, are ill suited for a battlefield where visibility equals vulnerability. This is not a temporary mismatch. It is a structural problem. Updating armor to counter drones, missiles, and real-time targeting requires years of redesign and testing, time Russia does not have in an active war. The hook that resonates most powerfully is this: the tank is no longer the king of the battlefield. The crown has passed to information, to sensors, to systems that see first and strike precisely. Russian armor is learning that lesson the hard way, one destroyed vehicle at a time. What was once a symbol of unstoppable power is now evidence of how quickly warfare evolves and how costly it is to fight the next war with the tools of the last one. At the center of these battlefield failures is a truth that authoritarian systems work tirelessly to conceal corruption doesn't just waste money, it kills. Russian tanks are not only being defeated by Ukrainian weapons, they are being defeated by years of siphoned budgets, falsified reports, and a defense industry built to satisfy superiors rather than protect soldiers. The hook is brutal and unavoidable. When corruption becomes systemic, it doesn't stay in offices and contracts. It shows up in combat as thin armor, malfunctioning systems, and crews sent into danger with equipment that was never truly ready. For years, Moscow announced ambitious modernization programs with impressive price tags and even more impressive promises: new armor composites, advanced optics, upgraded engines, improved protection systems. All of it looked convincing on paper and spectacular in parades. But soldiers on the front lines are discovering that much of this modernization existed more in reports than in reality. Funds earmarked for upgrades were skimmed at multiple levels, contractors cut corners to preserve profit, and oversight was often performative rather than real. The result is equipment that meets political expectations, not battlefield requirements. The hook that keeps resurfacing is this: corruption creates the illusion of strength until the moment strength is actually tested. Tanks delivered as modernized arrive with outdated components. Protective systems meant to stop incoming missiles fail to activate. Communications equipment malfunctions under stress. Maintenance logs claim readiness that the machines themselves cannot deliver. In peacetime, these failures can be hidden. In war, they are fatal. A tank that breaks down under fire is not a technical inconvenience, it's a death sentence. This problem is compounded by a culture that punishes honesty and rewards compliance. Officers and engineers who report defects risk careers, while those who certify flawed equipment are promoted for meeting quotas. The incentive structure is upside down. Success is defined by satisfying political timelines, not by producing durable, reliable systems. Over time, that culture calcifies. Truth becomes dangerous and lies become routine. By the time the tanks reach the battlefield, the system has already failed the soldiers expected to rely on them. There is also a maintenance reality that rarely makes it into official statements. Corruption doesn't stop once equipment is delivered. Spare parts disappear. Replacement components are substituted with inferior alternatives. Maintenance crews are undertrained or under-resourced. Vehicles that should be regularly serviced are pushed back into action because admitting mechanical failure invites scrutiny. Each shortcut compounds the next until a tank becomes a fragile machine operating far beyond its limits. Ukrainian forces don't have to destroy every tank outright. Many are defeated by neglect long before contact with the enemy. The human cost of this corruption is becoming increasingly visible. Crews forced to operate unreliable equipment know they are being asked to absorb the consequences of decisions made far above them. That knowledge breeds resentment and fear. Soldiers understand that no amount of bravery can compensate for defective armor or malfunctioning protection systems. When a tank fails to shield its crew from a strike it was advertised to withstand, the betrayal is not abstract. It's immediate, personal, and unforgettable. The hook here deepens corruption doesn't just weaken hardware, it erodes trust. An army depends on faith. Faith that leadership values soldiers' lives, faith that equipment will perform as promised, faith that risks are calculated rather than careless. When corruption strips that faith away, effectiveness collapses. Crews hesitate, units avoid exposure. Orders are followed mechanically rather than confidently. The battlefield becomes a place where survival instincts override strategy, and that is devastating for any military operation. Politically, this exposure is radioactive. The Kremlin's legitimacy rests partly on the claim that it restored order and competence after the chaos of the past. Battlefield evidence of corrupt failure undermines that claim at its core. Each destroyed tank becomes a physical manifestation of stolen funds and ignored warnings. Each malfunction tells a story the state cannot easily refute. It becomes harder to argue that losses are the result of external pressure alone when the internal rot is visible in every burned out vehicle. What makes this moment especially dangerous for those in power is that corruption is no longer an abstract accusation. It's measurable. Analysts can trace procurement contracts, compare promised specifications with observed performance, and connect the dots between budget figures and battlefield outcomes. Soldiers, journalists, and investigators don't need whistleblowers when the evidence is scattered across the terrain. The truth is being assembled piece by piece, vehicle by vehicle. The most gripping hook is that this corruption was avoidable. It wasn't imposed by an enemy. It was chosen through a system that prioritized loyalty over competence and image over integrity. And now, in combat, that choice is exacting its price in the only currency that matters at the front line: lives. What happens to an army when the people inside it stop believing that it can protect them? That is the quiet crisis now spreading through Russian ranks, and it may be more damaging than any single battlefield loss. Morale does not collapse overnight, it erodes slowly and relentlessly when expectations collide with reality. Russian soldiers entered this war having been told repeatedly that their equipment was modern, their armor reliable, and their leadership competent. What many have encountered instead is a daily confrontation with fear, uncertainty, and a growing sense that survival depends less on strategy and more on luck. The hook here is stark. Armies don't lose wars only because they run out of weapons. They lose when they run out of belief. Russian tank crews operating in Ukraine are doing so under constant pressure, knowing that their vehicles are vulnerable, visible, and often unreliable. When a soldier climbs into a tank believing it may not withstand the first strike, every movement becomes a calculated risk. Aggressive maneuvers give way to hesitation. Initiative gives way to caution. And over time, that hesitation reshapes how an entire force fights. Modern combat already places extraordinary psychological strain on troops, but the awareness that one's equipment may fail magnifies that stress exponentially. Drone surveillance means crews assume they are always being watched. Precision weapons mean mistakes are rarely forgiven. Add unreliable armor and poor situational awareness, and the result is an environment where fear becomes a constant companion. Soldiers begin to question orders not because they are disloyal, but because obedience feels increasingly disconnected from self-preservation. That internal conflict between duty and survival is corrosive. The erosion of morale also manifests in behavior that commanders struggle to control. Reports of abandoned vehicles, delayed advances, and reluctance to push forward are not simply tactical decisions, they are symptoms of diminished confidence. When soldiers believe their chances of survival are higher outside a tank than inside it, the logic of armored warfare collapses. Units begin to prioritize minimizing exposure over achieving objectives. Momentum stalls, coordination weakens. These are not failures of courage. They are rational responses to perceived abandonment by the system meant to protect them. Another hook lies in how morale spreads or collapses collectively. Soldiers talk, they share experiences, footage, and stories across units. One crew's close call becomes another crew's warning. One destroyed tank becomes a lesson learned the hard way. In tightly controlled militaries, leadership attempts to manage information, but fear is harder to censor than facts. When enough soldiers internalize the same doubts, morale doesn't just dip, it cascades. Confidence becomes the exception rather than the norm. This erosion is particularly damaging in a force built on hierarchy and command discipline. Russian military culture emphasizes obedience and centralized control, but morale is the invisible lubricant that makes such systems function. When trust in leadership weakens, orders may still be followed, but without conviction. That distinction matters. Soldiers operating without belief are less adaptable, less creative, and less resilient under pressure. They do what they are told, but they stop investing emotionally in outcomes. That emotional withdrawal is devastating in combat, where initiative often determines survival. The psychological toll also extends beyond the battlefield. Soldiers rotate back from the front, carrying stories that contradict official messaging. Families hear these accounts. Communities absorb them. Even in controlled information environments, lived experience has a way of leaking out. Morale erosion at the front eventually becomes skepticism at home, and skepticism is politically dangerous. An army's confidence is not isolated from society. It reflects and shapes broader perceptions of competence and legitimacy. There is also the question of leadership credibility. Officers tasked with motivating troops must reconcile official narratives with what their soldiers see every day. When leaders repeat assurances that contradict reality, they lose authority. When they acknowledge problems without the power to fix them, they appear impotent. Either outcome weakens command. Over time, soldiers learn to rely less on guidance from above and more on their own instincts, fragmenting cohesion. The most compelling hook is this: morale is the one battlefield advantage that cannot be manufactured quickly. Tanks can be replaced, tactics adjusted, units rotated, but once belief is broken, restoring it takes far longer than winning a single engagement. Russian forces are now fighting not only an external enemy, but an internal battle against doubt, fatigue, and disillusionment. And that internal battle, once lost, reshapes everything from how soldiers move to how they fight to whether they believe the mission is worth the cost. The most dangerous consequence of this exposure is not measured in destroyed vehicles or lost territory, but in what it does to Vladimir Putin's hold on power. Authoritarian leadership survives on a carefully maintained image of control, competence, and inevitability. When that image fractures, especially in public and especially through the voices of soldiers, the political damage can be profound. The hook here is unsettling for the Kremlin. Wars do not only end regimes through defeat, they weaken them through revelation. And what is being revealed now is a gap between promise and performance that is becoming impossible to conceal. Putin has long framed himself as the guarantor of Russian strength. His legitimacy is not rooted in democratic consent, but in the claim that he restored order, stability, and national pride. Military power sits at the center of that claim. When the armed forces appear strong, disciplined, and modern, the leader appears competent and necessary. When they appear disorganized, under-equipped, and exposed, that aura of necessity begins to fade. The exposure of failing tanks is therefore not a technical embarrassment, it is a political vulnerability. The hook deepens when we consider where this exposure is coming from. This is not a foreign narrative imposed from outside. It is emerging from the battlefield itself. Soldiers' accounts, leaked footage, and visible losses create a feedback loop the Kremlin struggles to control. State media can attempt to reframe events, but it cannot fully suppress evidence that circulates digitally and visually. Each destroyed tank becomes a symbol not only of military weakness, but of leadership failure, and symbols matter enormously in systems built on perception. Authoritarian power depends on fear and confidence coexisting. Citizens may tolerate repression if they believe the state is strong and competent. Elites may remain loyal if they believe the leader is indispensable. But when competence is questioned, loyalty becomes conditional. The exposure of military weakness introduces uncertainty into elite circles. Military leaders, regional officials, business figures who begin to reassess risks. The question quietly emerges: if the leadership misjudged something as fundamental as military readiness, what else has been misjudged? This uncertainty does not need to produce immediate opposition to be destabilizing. In fact, its most dangerous effect is subtle. Decision-making becomes cautious, initiative declines. Officials avoid responsibility. Blame is shifted downward. The system begins to protect itself rather than perform. That inward turn weakens governance at precisely the moment when cohesion is most needed. The hook here is that power erodes long before it collapses, and exposure accelerates that erosion. There is also a generational and institutional cost. Putin's narrative has relied heavily on historical symbolism, victory, resilience, strength against external threats. Tanks failing in modern combat undermine that narrative by suggesting that the past is being recycled without adaptation. For a leadership that draws legitimacy from historical continuity, being exposed as outdated is politically corrosive. It reframes authority as stagnation rather than stability. International perception feeds back into domestic power as well. When foreign governments, analysts, and even neutral states begin to treat Russia as less formidable than previously assumed, diplomatic leverage weakens. Sanctions become easier to maintain. Military deterrence loses credibility. Allies hedge. All of this reduces the strategic options available to the Kremlin. Power is not only exercised internally, it is reinforced externally. As that reinforcement diminishes, so does the leader's room to maneuver. The hook that carries the most weight is this: authoritarian leaders cannot easily admit mistakes. Correction requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement invites accountability. As a result, exposure creates a trap. Denial preserves short-term authority but deepens long-term damage. Reform risks appearing weak. Silence allows narratives to fill the void. Each option carries political cost, and the longer exposure continues, the higher that cost becomes. What makes this moment particularly sensitive is that the exposure is cumulative. One failure can be dismissed, a pattern cannot. As evidence accumulates, it reshapes expectations. Citizens lower their assumptions of competence. Soldiers adjust their trust. Elites revise their calculations. None of this requires protest or rebellion to be effective. Power begins to thin out quietly but persistently. The most compelling hook is that this exposure removes one of the regime's most powerful tools, inevitability. When strength looks fragile and competence looks performative, the future no longer feels fixed. And in authoritarian systems, the loss of inevitability is the beginning of political risk, because once people believe change is possible, even if distant, the foundations of unchecked power begin to shift. So tonight, the significance of this moment is not simply that a main battle tank has failed. It's that the people Putin depends on to fight his war are now exposing the reality he can no longer fully control. And history shows us this: when soldiers stop believing in the tools of the regime, and when reality punctures the myth of invincibility, power begins to shift in ways no leader can easily stop. That's the story unfolding here, and it's one Vladimir Putin cannot simply roll over with another tank parade.